Welcome to a Prevent Connect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
So this is the goal today is, Shifting Boundaries was created, it was NIJ, National Institute of Justice money that my research partner Bruce Taylor and I had starting in 2005. And we did it in school districts, first in Ohio. Is anybody here from Ohio? We did it in the greater Cleveland school districts for 2 years, and then we did it in the New York City schools for 10 years. Anybody here from New York City? No? City? No. Okay. And so what school folks did the interventions, right? And what I've been doing with California, with the Public Health Department in California, is through rape crisis centers. So we kind of consider this Shifting Boundaries 2.0 because it looks a little different because you all are coming in from, quote, the outside, because you're not a school employee, and coming into the schools. So that's sort of how we present and have been working together for 4 years. Do you want to, Ilana's here. Oh, and there's Devin.
So,
yes.
I'll talk about a little bit about this later too, but two of our rape crisis centers we're working with here in California are Safe West Solano, and Elena Starr is here from there, and Devin, and I can't pronounce your last name. Sokurka from Center for Nonviolent Community in Sonora. So they're gonna maybe chime in a little bit later and help us talk about shifting boundaries with y'all.
Okay, sorry for all these deviations here. So I was very shocked on April 30th, 2014. I was in South Dakota working with sexual assault and domestic violence coalitions, and the hotel that we were at had good internet, and so I saw the article that came out about the White House report on ending campus sexual assault, so I wanted to read it. I didn't want to read the Washington Post version of the article. I wanted to read the real report. So I kept clicking into, the stories to try to get it. So, that's the first slide there was what the report looked like, and then the middle slide is what the CDC issued, a companion report on the same day that the White House Not Alone report came out. And there was shifting boundaries being praised along with safe dates. And I thought, well, what are middle school kids doing in the White House report to end campus sexual assault? I mean, why would they have looked at safe dates is for 8th and 9th graders, shifting boundaries was for 6th and 7th graders? I mean, I was really puzzled because they reviewed 140 interventions. And most of them were interventions that were done in colleges. But they didn't find anything that had efficacy, that had effectiveness, that had evaluation behind it. So consequently, if they didn't start looking at middle school, they being the CDC, at middle school and high school, they basically would have issued a report that said, there's nothing to recommend. I mean, that's my opinion. But that's what I deduce from this. And so they had to start looking at interventions to reduce sexual violence that were working. So safe dates and shifting boundaries were the two with the most effectiveness, the most scientific data. It wasn't just evidence-based. The evidence was good, right? Lots of things are evidence-based, and they don't find things that are effective. So don't be swayed or misled by programs that say they're evidence-based. You have to look at the evidence to make sure it's effective. And then the two that were considered might be effective were Coaching Boys into Men, which is Liz Miller of the University, well, she was at UC Davis, but she's at the University of Pittsburgh, and then Bringing in the Bystander. So those were the ones that said they might be effective, they need more data. So I was very surprised on October 30th, 2014. And long ago and far away, this is how Bruce and I started doing research together, and we had three school districts, Cleveland Heights, Shaker Heights, and Berea, Ohio. In middle schools, no researchers had looked at middle schools in a scientific sort of way to do interventions on sexual violence and sexual harassment. We had 123 classrooms, and we had created 2 different kinds of interventions, and then the schools were assigned randomly. You didn't get to pick, right? This is what randomization means. You get assigned, and hopefully you stick with the program. The next phase of shifting boundaries, we moved to the New York City schools, which is the largest school district in the country. And we were in 54 middle schools from 2008 to 10. And then from 2011 onward, what we looked at was dosage. Like, how often did you have to have shifting boundaries to have an impact? And so I will be explaining all of these in a bit. So how our study is different, I have always been saying that sexual harassment and that schools are the training grounds for domestic violence through the public performance of sexual harassment. I've been saying this since the 1990s, and probably the biggest article I ever wrote was in the Harvard Educational Review in 1995, in a whole issue devoted to youth and violence, about schools were the training grounds for domestic violence. And this public performance, much of which is witnessed by adults. Some of it is privatized, and if kids get the sense that they're allowed to do this in public, why wouldn't they think they could do it in private, right? So the money stream that came from NIJ was on teen dating violence, but Bruce and I thought it was more effective to frame this as sexual harassment as a precursor to teen dating violence, because a lot of 11-year-olds, quite frankly, are not dating, right? I mean, they might affiliate in some capacity, and might go together, for a week or 2 weeks, whatever. But we wanted to, frame this in a way that schools would find receptive, and they knew they need to comply with federal law Title IX, which is sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination. We emphasized boundaries and personal space. We never talked about healthy relationships. It's not in there. That's on purpose. Part of the reason is the Justice Department is our funder, not the CDC, but also that I consider healthy relationships to be a rather subjective framework, and that a lot of middle school kids I'm a former middle school teacher, by the way. I had 36 kids in my class. So I'm very good at bossing people around and rearranging rooms. And a lot of middle school kids are always being told things like, stop eating that, it's bad for you, get up, don't sit down, go play outside, get exercise. So there's all this sort of enforcement of middle school kids' behavior, and I don't think they're very receptive to discussions of healthy relationships. And finally, the other key point is that this is the youngest sample that was ever done in a randomly controlled trial, that's an RCT, on teen dating violence. So we did mostly 11 to 13-year-olds were in our study. This is a slide, and you can get access to our slides, right? They're all on this conference website. Has anybody looked at those in advance? I actually did, but did you look at them? They're there. So you can have a copy of the slides, so don't be worried about getting this. So the next 2 slides are basically prior research on teen dating violence and harassment. Most of them have either been with 8th graders and high school kids, and very few of them have been these randomly controlled trials. One of them is David Wolf, who's a Canadian, with the 4th R, which has been done in a lot of US schools as well. And coaching boys into men, Liz Miller, who's right next door, did 16 high schools, and then It's Your Game, which was more about sex ed. So in any event, there's been studies, but they're not quite online with what we're doing. This is a slide that looks at survey research, and this national strive is 10 to 18-year-olds. So here's 68% of kids reporting teen dating violence victimization, 62% reporting perpetration. And then the AAUW, which is the American Association of University Women, they did a study in a survey, and they always have the Harris pollsters, those people that predict elections and stuff. They do their survey research. So one of them was in 93, 2001, and 2011. And this is the percent is 48% of kids saying that they had experienced it. I wanted to mention the Davis v. Monroe case. That's a Supreme Court case. Are people familiar with this case? Anybody know it? Anybody from Georgia here? You know this case? Monroe County, Georgia. So LaShonda Davis was a 5th grade girl in 5th grade in Monroe County, and there was a boy in her class who's only known by his initials, and he was constantly touching her. He wasn't poking her in the shoulder. He was trying to grab her breasts, her genital area. He kept talking about the sexual things he was going to do to her. He took one of those rubber door stoppers that, you put under the door to leave it open. He put it in his pants to simulate an erection. He tried bamming her up against the walls. He wasn't subtle, this child. She kept asking to have her seat moved. She asked her teachers, her parents came down to the school to ask to have the seat moved. The teacher would never move their seat. As a former 6th, 7th, and 8th grade teacher, let me tell you, I always move kids' seats, even if they liked each other too much, right? And they were just chatty. So moving your seats is like the easiest thing to do. Nobody would change his seat. After 5 months, her grades started to drop a lot, and her parents found a suicide note. At that point, they filed a criminal complaint with the police. The boy pled guilty to sexual misconduct. In Georgia law, an 11-year-old can be charged. His family moved away, and her parents then got the National Women's Law Center, which is a legal advocacy group in D.C., to represent the family for the next 5 years, pro bono, as they went through every level of the federal courts. So they went to district court, the Circuit Court of Appeals, and very few cases get to the Supreme Court, but it did. I went to the oral arguments. I stood in line on a very cold January morning. These were, I knew the lawyers. I'd never seen a Supreme Court case argued. I wanted to go. I got in. 4 months later, on May 24th, 1999, Sandra Day O'Connor wrote the majority opinion, and it said that schools can be held liable for sexual harassment if they knew about it and failed to take any action. And so it was unequivocal then, even though it was 5-4, it was still a decision from the Supreme Court. So that is an important case because it says that schools can be sued for compensatory damages. So the Davis case applies to the whole country. I've certainly had school administrators in other parts of the country think that somehow the Davis case doesn't apply to them, or even that Title IX doesn't apply to them, but it does. Do people know Title IX? Like, what do you think of when you hear Title IX? What do you think of mostly? Of equality of what? Yeah, but sports. So it's equality of funding is one of the major things, and equal opportunity. So it's equal opportunity if you want to take a certain course, that's even if it's unconventional, like if you're a female and you want to study air conditioning maintenance, you can be allowed to take it. If you're a male who wants to study childcare, you should be allowed to take that. It also applies so guidance and counseling is a provision under Title IX, so is athletic opportunities. All schools have to have a Title IX coordinator. Many of those people don't know that they've been designated. You only need one. You don't have to have one in each building. You have to have one in each school district. So there are lots of provisions of Title IX, and I think it's very prudent to remind schools that they have to enforce federal law Title IX, and there are many dimensions of it. So sports is what people know because there were big sports budgets at stake that especially college women would sue against. So finally, just to finish up, that you can see that sexual harassment, DV is dating violence /H harassment, has lots of health consequences that are not healthy. Okay, so after Ohio, we get into the New York City schools, and we started with 54, and 30 of them completed everything. So we had, obviously parental permission. We had to take our research design through what's known as the Institutional Review Board to make sure that the protection of human subjects. There was passive consent, or what's known, and there's another term for it now, but it's not passive consent. But in any event, if the parents objected, they had to sign the form and send it back. And we ended up with 30 schools doing everything. So that meant before the interventions, immediately after, and 6 months later. And you can get a copy of the huge survey we used. You know, you had to fill in the bubbles. I don't recommend that you try to use it. It costs a lot of money to tabulate it. So in any event, we make it public and available. So those were the waves of data, and the total number of kids that we had, it was 2655, pretty much half and half. This is what random assignment looked like. So it was done in two ways. Some schools only did classroom interventions, okay? Some schools did both classroom interventions and school-wide interventions. So that's the both. And some just did school-wide interventions with no classroom interventions, and then there were control schools that did nothing. Okay, and so this was randomly assigned. The whole school would behave in such a way. And it came out, as you see, 15 schools. I mean, it was structured in terms of school-wide interventions, both interventions, classroom only. Okay, you understand? Bruce is the methodologist. I always say without Bruce, I wouldn't have a methodology, and he says without me, he wouldn't be able to get into schools. So we're kind of a good team. It's very hard for me to channel Bruce, though. And the school-wide interventions, let me just run through those. There were 3 of them. One of them was what we called Respecting Boundaries Agreement. It was our version of a quit it or restraining order, but we weren't allowed to use anything that sounded legally. And because we were calling this boundaries, there's lots of discussion of boundaries. Actually, some high-up person in the New York City schools thought of the idea of calling it a Respecting Boundaries Agreement. And in New York, I mean, their discipline manual is like 26 pages, and for kids in middle school, if you have a first offense that's in the verbal realm or written realm, you get a counseling intervention. So it's not a physical trying to grab somebody or pull their clothes off. So this Respecting Boundaries Agreement was considered a counseling intervention. You see what I'm saying? So it's not like immediately you're suspended for calling somebody a hoe, but you'd have a counseling intervention, and the Respecting Boundaries Agreement was one of those. Hotspot mapping comes from cops. Police invented this, where they looked at crime. You know, where does crime happen during the school day, during the whole day? And we gave the kids color pencils, and the teachers had to provide a blueprint of the school of some sort. And the kids color-coded where they felt safe and unsafe, and I'll show you some samples. And the final of the 3 school-wide interventions was posters like that one of that boy down there that were gigantic. I'm not kidding. They were like half the size of each one of these panels, or maybe a third of the size, but they were really big. And we gave multiple copies to the school. There were 6 different kinds of posters, all very striking images, black and white, as you can see. And at the bottom, each school would put a little stickum that would stay permanently on that would say, if you want to talk more about this, go see Mr. So-and-so in room blankety-blank or Ms. So-and-so in room blankety-blank. You can get the zip files for these posters from my webpage on the Wellesley College website. So we make those available. You can get those for free, and you can print them to whatever size your budget or your printers allow, right? And a lot of the guidance counselors didn't have enough space in their offices for the gigantic ones, and they wanted smaller ones. But we told the schools that these should be placed in places where kids congregated. So like the bathrooms, by the cafeteria, by the auditorium, by the entryway, not simply in classrooms because, not that many kids see it, but in areas around the school. So all 3 of these do not require being done in a classroom. You see that? So that's why they're known as school-wide interventions. You can do them in a study hall. You can do them through the guidance person coming and talking. It doesn't require the teacher to hand out lessons. So now I'll show you some samples. So this is obviously the teacher got a copy of the blueprint of the school. Green is where the kids feel safe, and yellow is mixed, where they feel, moderately one way or the other, and red is danger. And the only information we asked for was the gender of the child and the grade they're in. So this person indicated that they were a 7th grade boy. So why do you think this side of the A, of what looks like a letter A, is all red? Just what's your hypothesis? Yes?
Probably areas where teachers don't have eyes on students.
That's, okay, that's one hypothesis, yes? Yeah, I think it's where the 8th graders were. So this is, they didn't want to go over into that zone. It was intimidating. So that's just a very straightforward look at a hotspot map. Here's a one that I'm not sure the teacher designed, right? And wait, it gets even more clear. This is a female, and the grade might be on here, but you see, oh yeah, 7th grade female. Okay, so you may not, what she's done here is that the staircases are the red spots, the red zones for her, which is clearly like where the teachers aren't. It's also crowded. You might be encountering kids of older ages and stuff. It's scary. That's where she put. But there's one staircase right in the middle that's yellow, and there are other parts which are green are classrooms. So this is just to show you the variation. This one clearly a teacher handed out because it's so neat, and only one place for this child, which is a 6th grade boy, came out as red, and that was a stairway, one stairway. And here's my favorite, actually. So it's a girl. She indicates, even with misspelling, where she doesn't feel comfortable. You see that? So the girl's bathroom, she put uncomfortable, even though she colored it yellow. She put this as danger, which is the cafeteria. She put comfortable in classrooms. Outside was uncomfortable, that was red, danger she called it. And uncomfortable was this, I think it's like a library or some kind of study hall room up in the corner. And so even with not being able to spell correctly, she's still able to convey to us what her experiences of school. What happens after you do these is you collect them and you take a sample map and you basically code it. You start tallying it up. How many 7th grade boys put down the cafeteria is safe, how many put it down as unsafe, right? So you tally up every zone, assuming you're in the same school. It's not across schools, it's in your building. And then you present that data to a school-wide committee, a school-wide safety committee that's generally made up of people from the community, so it has groups like yourself in it, the police, might have some ministers. It certainly has parents and student representation. So this is not just a cathartic coloring activity. This is an activity to get data. And kids' experiences and this mapping is data. So you get that? This is another form of data. It's not a survey, but this is data letting you know how kids feel. So it becomes a very important activity. All right, and then the 6 classroom lessons, we basically talk about laws only through the notion of the terms boundaries and personal space. We're not beating kids over the head talking about law. We do get into discussions in 7th grade about sexual harassment, but not 6th grade. And there's discussions about law when we get to 7th grade. That another major theme is about setting and communicating boundaries, and finally, the focus is on dating violence and not broader harassment. Yes? Because what we decided to do, she has to be, can you repeat the question?
Why not start at 6th grade instead of 7th grade?
Well, what we decided to do was that the 6th grade teachers would make a commitment of 4 lessons over 6 class periods. And the 7th graders, the teachers would teach 6 lessons over 6 class periods. I'm not dogmatically opposed to it at all, that you don't start talking about law in 6th grade. It's just that's how we structured it, to make it a little more incremental. So you can get a copy of Shifting Boundaries. It's a free PDF on the internet. The best way to get it is you go to my Wellesley College website page. I mean, there's a version of it you can get through the National Institute of Justice in our final report. There's a version of it, I think, on the OVW website. There's a version of it on crimestoppers.gov, which is the Justice Department's catalog, so to speak, of effective programs. But the best way to get it is through the Wellesley College website, because then you're getting everything together, like the zip files for the posters and stuff. I'm not opposed, but remember, this was 2005, and nobody had done anything with kids that young. Now it's 2018, so I think there's probably more discourse going on about discussions of law. Little kids know things about how they have to be strapped in a car seat, or they have to wear a bike helmet. I mean, kids have ideas about law when they're very young because parents talk to them about it. But that was just sort of our arbitrary decision. And when we got to New York, we had a year of meetings with lots of content experts throughout the New York City schools. So whether it was the gang people or the health education people or the counseling people, and we decided to keep it that way. They could have changed it if they wanted it. We would have changed for them, but they didn't. So we left it that way. So I want to go on because we've got to get to Mina's part. So the next slide is about what happened from 2011 to 14 and 15. So the upshot of what we learned from 08 to 10 was that the school-wide interventions were more effective when compared to the classroom interventions alone. The most effective was when everything was combined. But if you were just going to compare school-wide interventions with classroom interventions, school-wide interventions were more effective because it was affecting the whole school, not just itty-bitty classrooms. I mean, kids think that way. That's concrete operational thinking in some sense. And so we were a little surprised, but so we went with that. And what we did was, we added 8th grade, but then we wanted to see, when do you need to receive this to get the most benefit out of it, right? So one group of schools got randomly put into, they would only do it in 6th grade. Another group of schools got put into the group where they would do it in 6th and 7th grade at the same time. The third group, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders were all getting it. And the fourth group is the 6th graders got it when they were 6th graders, then they got it when they became 7th graders, then they got it when they became 8th graders. So you were focusing only on the group of kids that came in as 6th graders. You see what I'm saying? And so we wondered, how early to intervene, how often to intervene, how broadly to intervene. These are questions that we looked at. And we compared them. This is Bruce's work. And what turns out to be the most effective was, if you just delivered it to 6th graders and 7th graders compared to only 6th graders, you reduced sexual harassment victimization. So 6th and 7th together was very effective. I mean, we did have a feeling that if you only did it once, 6th grade, and you did it throughout their career in middle school, it would be effective. But my sense always was, if you're not including the 8th graders who kind of rule the school, you'd be more effective if you did include them. So Bruce feels like we have to do more research to really find out the sort of dosage, this is called. And we'd hate school officials to think, oh, we can just do this once in 6th grade and be done with it. But who knows? These are the other posters that I was referring to. So as I said, you can get the zip files from my page on the Wellesley College website. And now I get to California. And we've been working together since 2016 to work in these 2 programs. One is very urban. The kids are even in, what are they called, modular units, because of the surplus of kids. The school can't hold all the kids. And the other one is very rural. And hopefully there'll be more schools to go. But the requirement, and I stand by this, and we're really strict on this, you have to start with school-wide interventions first. You have to do that. Not rush to do classroom. That's what everybody does. They think it's easier, it's more fun, you get feedback right away from the kids. No, you got to have a memorandum of agreement of some sort with the school officials that you can do the school-wide interventions with their participation. Once they do that, then you can start moving in to doing the classroom lessons. And Mina is the evaluator of all of this, and she'll talk about how the evaluation gets built into this. So what we want you to do right now in just a quick little way is, or maybe just bring it up to us, is that if you've implemented shifting boundaries in the past or you're thinking about doing it, what would it take? What would it take to do it, to implement it? I'm not reading it correctly, am I? If your school is rural or K-8 or has a lot of teacher turnover, how could you accommodate those kind of problems and still implement shifting boundaries? Answer that question. Don't listen to me. Answer whatever's written up there.
It's implemented in California as part of the RP program that's funded by the Centers for Disease Control Prevention. So with that, we fund multiple sites around California, but the site that Devin and Elena work at are 2 of our sites that implement shifting boundaries, and we call them our full implementation sites. And we know a lot of the sites around California might do parts of shifting boundaries, either just the curriculum, the classroom lessons, or we know a lot of sites also do just mapping exercises. So we call their sites the full implementation sites because they do both together in the same school. And those are SafeQuest and CNBC. I do want to show, I know you can't read all the wording here, but I do want to show a little bit of the implementation guide here. This is the guide that Nan referred to earlier as far as the documentation that CDPH and Nan put together to give to our rape crisis centers that are implementing shifting boundaries. We know that the curriculum is available on all those websites that Nan mentioned, but there really wasn't any sort of documentation available for our rape crisis centers on really how to implement it, or some of the other pieces involved in implementing it, other than just having the lessons available. And then we can always bring Nan out to do trainings, but that gets a little expensive to have her fly out from Boston every year. So we wanted to do this guide and to be able to give everyone something that shows kind of all the steps involved in implementing shifting boundaries in our state. So as she mentioned, the school-wide school environment interventions are what we wanted to establish first, including the RBA, including talking to the school administration, to the teachers, principals, staff, everyone on campus is about what the RBI means, what all the hotspot mapping means, and what all the posters and the classroom lessons really mean for what they're expecting on campus and what those changes mean on campus. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the social ecological model. How many have seen this before? Probably most of you. So we really wanted our intervention, our prevention program to be based on this model. Shifting Boundaries is implemented as part of a comprehensive sexual violence primary prevention program. So we wanted all the layers of this model to be connected with each other within the strategy of using shifting boundaries in the school, and carry this forward with working with the students, with working with the staff, with working with on policies and procedures related to what's going on in the school. So trying to cover all those levels. And how we tried to do that is to address the RBA and the curriculum with those administrators, as I mentioned earlier. Part of that is acting on that mapping data. The maps are really part of what the school-wide interventions involve to address the system-wide change in the school setting. For this implementation of shifting boundaries in California, we really kind of expected that the facilitators discuss the RBA with the school, and that they work together to revise those school policies and procedures. So it wasn't just something where the students had the form available and they kind of just used it as they saw fit. It was something really that we really wanted everyone on the campus and all the staff administrators to be involved in. The ultimate goal then in that is to prevent sexual violence and harassment on campus. And we talked a little bit earlier about getting that buy-in from schools. As we mentioned earlier, the MOUs with the school districts was really important. I don't know how many stories we've heard from some of our centers about, they kind of put a school in their scope of work, and then we find out, that the school really doesn't want to participate. So it was something where that dialogue and that relationship has to happen first before any sort of establishment of a program in a school can happen. The potential work with the school wellness corners is something that we've really helps in getting shifting boundaries involved or integrated in the school. There are a number of staff at schools that can possibly be involved in this process, ranging from some schools have school-based health centers. Some schools have like a school counselor that can really help get the program started. So just getting buy-in from those, any sort of gatekeepers or any sort of school staff that can really get the program started is key. One thing that also helps, and this is maybe after some kind of relationship has been established with the school, is really reviewing that baseline school data with the school staff and administrators, whether they have data from the YRBS, which is the Youth Risk Behavioral Surveillance System. Some schools have data from what's called the California Healthy Kids Survey. That's a California-specific survey. But that does collect data on some school climate measures, some safety measures, some just sort of resilience measures on campus. So that's some data that is available for some schools that you can use, and it really helps to review that type of data with the school, so they sort of get a sense of what's going on campus, and if they see there's a problem with safety on campus, they might be more likely to talk to you about having shifting boundaries on their campus. One thing that's helped in some of our other sites too is just explaining how that data from mapping can tell the story about the overall school climate. One thing that it is key is really making sure that the school staff and the school board, that the administrators are really on board for creating some sort of change after they see the data. And it's great that we collect data as part of shifting boundaries. But if they never see the data, or if they never are able to use that to do anything with it, that doesn't really help your program, or it doesn't help the school either. So it really helps to get that buy-in that way. So I want to ask a quick question again. What are some ways that you think shifting boundaries can make changes in the overall school environment? That's something that's come up a lot recently, about really how we can really make community change, and looking at the school environment as the school community. What are some ways that we think that shifting boundaries can change that school environment? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the data that we've collected as part of shifting boundaries, and I just want to preface it with this data is part of the RPE program evaluation. It's not a research project, so it's definitely not like the data that Nan presented with a fully funded evaluation research project. So it's really very small scale. It's data that's been collected from SafeQuest and from CNVC. There is also mapping data that we use to look at as far as the outcome evaluation, and we look at pre-post surveys that were developed and implemented as part of the program. So this data is from 2016 to 2018. I do want to talk a little bit about how some of the pre-post survey data surveys was revised based on looking at some of the data from 2016-17. We looked at 1 year of data, and I was surprised looking at some 1 year data where it seemed as if some of the outcomes on the answering the questions, they didn't seem to improve very much. And I think after talking to Elena and Devin about some of the data, it seemed as if they didn't, on the pre-test, when we were asking them about a question that involved boundaries, they didn't seem to actually know what a boundary was yet because they hadn't received the curriculum yet, so they didn't really know how to answer the question. So there was this sort of quandary we got into where they didn't know what they didn't know yet. So we revised the questions a little bit, and we did ask a question about how they would define a boundary just to get at how many of those kids understood what a boundary was before they began the pretest. So this is just kind of talking a little bit about how we sort of looked at data and from there sort of revised how we were evaluating. And I did want to add too that we also realized we really needed to get a full picture of the school climate first to see where the school was at before we looked at that quantitative data. Elena gave me some really good examples about how, at one of her schools, they had a lot of teacher turnover. Was it half the 6th grade teachers were new. They had a brand new principal. There were a lot of fights breaking out on campus. So with all of that, we have to take all that into account too when we look at the data because it's a lot to counteract when we're running a small RPE program, with just like 6th graders to counter everything they might be getting at home, on campus, kind of restarting all over and educating the staff and the new teachers, the new principal. So that's sort of some more of the qualitative piece that we kind of build in when we look at our data to really take that into account when we look at some of the results. I don't know if you can read all this, but and I'll go through kind of quickly because I think I'm running out of time. But I do want to show some of the data from 2016-17. I won't read all these questions, and you'll have these slides if you're on CalCASA website. But a lot of the questions that asked about knowledge and awareness about boundaries did increase slightly. You'll see that some of the pretest measures improved from like 74% to 77% for this first question, from 48 to 54% for this second question, from 51 to 58 for this third question, and from 61% to 72% for the fourth question, which says if Cora did not physically hurt someone, then she did not cross her boundary. So that percentage is the percentage that answered correctly on the post-test versus the pre-test. This data is from 2017-18 from the same questions. I did want to point out, so this is what I want to discuss and maybe get a little bit of feedback in the little time that I have left. But the first question, which is Brian hurt Sarah's feelings by calling her name. Afterwards, he said he was joking around. Brian did not cross Sarah's boundary because he was just joking. So the correct answer would be it's a true or false question, and that did not improve very much in 17-18 versus 16-17. So we were wondering why that might be the case. 5 minutes. I don't know if either Devin or Elena have any input on maybe like why on their campuses that maybe we were seeing that. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you had mentioned some other things involved in that.
So our school, and I know Mina talked about it, the school that we're in right now, our middle school, a lot of violence happens. So there's a lot of school violence. It's not just sexual, and I don't just mean just sexual harassment, but I mean, there's a lot of things going on. There were a lot of incidences at school that were very physical and violent. And so I noticed the students, because this is the one, after he said it's just joking, that's really prevalent at our school actually, and a lot of students were like, oh, it's just a joke, it's just accepted, this happens every day, and so it's very integrated, and so I think that's probably why it didn't change too much. I can speak for mine. I don't know if Devin, you want to add?
Do you have anything?
Yeah, I would just say the same sort of things. A lot of students at our school, we're in a very like rural, non-diverse community, and there's a lot of it's a smaller school, and there's a lot of students who want to be like popular, and humor is the best way, right? And so people are like, oh, well, it's just a joke, so it doesn't matter, it doesn't mean anything. And so I know like our data, I think it like, from what I remember when I was doing it, was that there was a little bit of an increase specifically for us, but still that was something that we had a lot of conversation about was, okay, even though it's a joke, you know, this is still like sexual harassment. This is still, it doesn't make it okay just because someone says, haha, just kidding. So there's a lot of conversation about that.
I'll skip over that for now. I know I only have a couple minutes. So one thing that we also did see was some actually increased reports of sexual harassment. Though I think in talking to everyone else, we kind of expected that because, you know, with the first couple of years, 1 or 2 years of a program, they kind of get to see that it is a problem versus before where they didn't even realize that anything existed and that they didn't recognize the sexual harassment that was going on campus was actually even sexual harassment. So just recognizing that as a problem kind of made these reports go up. So we hope to continue our evaluation in the future, hopefully more long-term, so that we can really get some longer-term data from this project and kind of see a decrease eventually. I do want to talk about, well, in the couple minutes I have, about the changes in school environments that we've seen. So this is even, I feel like this is even more important than just even like looking at the pre-post data for the students. We do see some changes in the policies and procedures, as Elena and Devin kind of mentioned earlier. The changes that they've been able to enact with the RBAs and talking to the staff and administrators, and also in showing them the mapping data that they've had, and also just building those school relationships with the administrators and the staff. In Sonora, I know Devin has shared me about identifying the gaps in the student procedures and codes of conduct. They were able to draft a positive behavior attitude matrix that they presented to the school board and got approved. And so this was really shared with parents and the staff, and that was able to be adopted from their school. They were able to change staff behavior. There's one thing that happened in the mapping was that they realized that some of the school staff wasn't paying attention during recesses and during breaks. So they really worked with the school staff in trying to change that. And then the other thing that I already mentioned was just even the staff being really integrated into the school environment. So next steps are, one thing we've learned is something, someone brought it up earlier, but about really involving youth more in some of this decision making, and really looking at how we can get more adult allies engaged and youth leaders engaged in making these decisions, and possibly using looking at some of the data together as even if getting the adult allies, staff, and the youth involved as a group as a whole, and looking at it together to really come together as a group to work on these school-wide components of shifting boundaries. And continued evaluation, of course. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.